Hello, everyone from the virtual sphere, and thank you all for joining our panel today on equity, diversity, and inclusion in research. My name is Anne Gabriel, and I am the Senior Vice President for Global Strategic Relations at Elsevier, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. Elsevier is proud to be hosting this session and several others at CSPC this year, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion with our wonderful group of panelists and experts. We believe that our topic has been made even more urgent in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course has had a huge impact on research and poses a threat to some of the hard-won advances in equity, diversity, and inclusion in the context of both gender as well as race and ethnicity. It has become more important than ever for the scientific community to bring these underlying issues to the fore and create concrete strategies to address them. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today, who will each share their views on this topic from their respective areas of expertise. First, Dr. Bamini Jayabalasingham from Elsevier will share data from Elsevier's latest gender report, which illustrates the underrepresentation of women in the research workforce. Next, we have Dr. Flaminio Squazzoni from the University of Milan and peer New Frontiers of Peer Review, who will be presenting selected excerpts from peer's recent study on the pandemic's effects of article submissions from women. Following that, we have Dr. Falk-Krzesinski, also from Elsevier, to share insights from a study by the International Center for Study of Research, ICSR, which examines the extent to which gender is being captured in research across each of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. Next, Dr. Charlene Fauve from NIH will present NIH research on the current racial and ethnic disparity in research funding and strategies for closing the gap at key stages in the research enterprise. And finally, last but certainly not least, Dr. Cara Tannenbaum from the Canadian Institutes of Health and Research, University of Montreal, and Health Canada will discuss the necessity of integrating sex and gender in scientific research with a focus on case studies from Canada. Panel, I am delighted to welcome you, and I'll also be moderating questions from the audience later in the session, so please do put them in the chat. Thank you, everybody. First up, Dr. Jayabalasingham, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Anne. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be invited to talk about this subject. So I wanted to kick off this panel with an overview of the landscape and where we stand with women's representation in research. And the findings I'll be presenting can be found in an Elsevier study that I led called The Research Journey Through a Gender Lens. There's a little picture of the study at the cover of the report on the bottom left-hand corner of my slide. The report covers gender balance in research participation, career progression, and collaboration networks. The analyses were done at the country level and are based on 15 countries. And in addition to quantitative analyses, we've also presented the results of surveys and qualitative analyses in the report. So first, I'd like you to focus, we'll start looking at some of the data that we uncovered based on our analyses. So this chart, I'd like you to focus first on the the first column, the median. It shows the median value for the ratio of women to men among actively publishing authors in 15 countries in the report. We define actively publishing as having published at least 2 publications in the 5-year period, and we compare 2 time periods. Authors from the period 1999 to 2003, that's the square at the bottom, and authors from the period 2014 to 2018, that's the circle. So the black line near the 100 mark denotes parity. It's equal. It's where the dot or square would be if there were an equal number of women and men in the author group. And what you see is that the ratio of women to men is closer to parity now than in the past. In the earlier period, there were about 4 women authors per 10 men, and now we're seeing about 6 women authors per 10 men authors. So now if you focus your gaze on the colored squares and dots on the chart, you can see that there's a lot of variation that feeds into this median, right? So as I mentioned, the values presented in the first column are the median based on these countries. When we look specifically at each of the countries, we see the nuance in the data. While the trend is captured, captured by the median is true for every country, that is, the gender ratio is closer to parity now than in the past, we see quite some variation from country to country. Argentina, Brazil, and Portugal are where you currently see ratios closest to parity, while Japan is furthest from parity. And the amount of change over time also varies. For most countries, there are now about 20 more women per 100 men. And whereas in Japan, the increase in terms of absolute count was the lowest among the 15 countries, going from 11 women to 18 women per 100 men. So in terms of percentage difference, this represents a 60% increase, which actually puts it on par with countries such as Canada, the US, and Great Britain. But in absolute terms, we're seeing the lowest representation of women among authors in Japan. So looking at the active author population as a whole can give you an idea of the overall trends. But to get a better understanding about the 2014 to 2018 authors, we analyzed this group further. We separated authors into 4 groups based on the first year they published as a proxy for the author age. And we're relying on the assumption that authors who first published in an earlier time frame are likely older or more senior, while those who first published more recently are younger. So in these charts, the darkest purple dots in the 15-country median represents gender ratio among those who started publishing research in 2003 prior, while the lightest purple reflects the data among those who recently first started publishing, the youngest authors, so to speak. And we see that the composition of authors is closest to parity among the youngest group, while the more senior group is furthest from parity. So again, this trend that women are more highly represented among junior authors and are less represented among senior authors is observed in each country, regardless of the overall ratio, so that the author composition is closest to parity in the youngest group, and the more senior group is furthest from parity, regardless of the country that is. This also suggests that there are a lot of women in the pipeline, so to speak. So it speaks to that pipeline issue that has often been pointed to as a reason for a paucity of women in research. So what about subject-to-subject differences? So when we compare the ratio of women to men in each subject, now compared in the past, we see that in some fields, such as medicine and social sciences, we've seen great increases in the proportion of women among authors, while in others, such as engineering, shown here, we've seen a very low increase in women among authors. This data on the slide shows author proportions for the period 2014 to 2018, and each of the dots represents a different country. What's interesting is that when you focus on this group of active authors from this period, we see the same trends per country, where these two factors, country and research field, interact. So for example, you see Argentina and Portugal have the highest proportion of women among authors in all fields, while Japan has the lowest. So far, we've looked at gender ratio among authors and seen how it differs across countries, age groups, and subjects. We also expect some variation when we look at authorship position. What's presented here is the gender ratio observed among different author positions relative to overall. Each dot represents the ratio for one country. If the dot is close to the black line in the middle, it means that the ratio is similar to the ratio overall. So the purple dots in this chart represent first authors, and we can see that this group is most similar to the group overall. It's also the largest group, so it's being reflected. It's most reflective of the overall ratio. Corresponding authors, shown in blue, are further from the overall average, with more men in this group. And last authors, shown in red, have the lowest representation. of women among authors. And this may be a reflection of the fact that last authors are often more senior authors. So again, we have the interaction of two factors, seniority and authorship position, to affect the representation that we're seeing. So that's a summary, very fast summary of all the data, of some of the data actually in the report. It's quite a hefty report. I have my email here if anyone wants to direct questions to me after the panel, and I look forward to the question section at the end. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bamini, for that. Again, if you all have questions, please do put them in the chat and we can address those at the end of the session. Next, we have Dr. Flaminio Squazzoni, who is going to speak with us. Dr. Squazzoni, perhaps we can bring up your slides. Fantastic.
Yeah, thank you very much, and very happy to be here in this panel. I'd like first to say that I'm going to introduce a recent work we have done in collaboration with Elsevier and University of Valencia and the University of Växjö in Sweden, and it's been a very fantastic collaboration, including computer scientists, social scientists, and people from the publishing industry. And I'm very proud to share this kind of research. And I'm following the previous presentation in the sense that what we have done was to zoom on what happened during the pandemic worldwide in terms of women academics submitting manuscripts and peer reviewing in those very critical months. And this required incredible effort, especially from Elsevier and our team, to share a massive amount of data during the COVID pandemic. And so, for instance, we got data on more than 2,000 Elsevier journals, all the Elsevier journals. We got data from 2018, 2019, and 2020. And the idea was trying to run analysis on the individual level of each scholar who submitted a paper to Elsevier journals in these last 2 years, and understand, like in a quasi-natural experiment, if they were affected during the pandemic. And so our analysis included all fields of research, so journals from all the fields and all the manuscript. We also have data about peer review requests and performance and task performed by scholars in terms of peer review. And so we could also control for each scholar using mobility data from Google to try to compare scholars from the same country under the same kind of lockdown measures, and in order to try to be sure that we were really capturing some effect about this kind of pandemic. So we estimated the gender and the seniority of about 6 million scholars, and who submitted in this kind of 3 years. And again, this required a lot of effort, because typically those data are not designed for research. They are data which come typically from manuscript submission systems, which are, as you know, designed for running journals and not for research. And this also, as part of this kind of collaboration with computer scientists, data scientists on cleaning and preparing data. And so what we found in this kind of data was that the pandemic months from February to May 2020 included an incredible boom of submission to many journals, but there are specific case in journal in health got more than an increase of more than 90% of submission from February to May 2020 compared to the same time window of the previous years. So it seems that, you know, that's been a kind of stress test for many journals, for many reviewers, for many editors, about how to deal with this kind of submissions. And so there has been an increase in opportunities to publish research during those months. And not only COVID-related papers, but we got an increase also in non-COVID-related papers in general. So there has been an increase of productivity and publication and submission from scientists. However, when we try to control, the influence of gender and age and seniority, so we end up with these results, which is quite striking in a way that women submitted fewer manuscripts than what they submitted in the previous years in the same journals, in the same field, according to the same kind of seniority. And so we control for what we could control for many kind of different effects. And even if you compare scientists and scholars from the same country, so you control and you compare Italians with Italian men, Italian women in the same field, submitted to similar journals with similar number of authors, you still find this kind of statistical effect about the fact that women submitted less, fewer manuscripts than what expected during this kind of pandemic. But the interesting factor is that when we control for the seniority, what we found was that the penalties in terms of a number of manuscripts submitted were stronger for women at a later stage of their career. So it seems that professors or scholars having a tenure track submitted fewer manuscripts than younger scholars. And this probably also is linked to the previous presentations about the change in demography of this. And what we could probably provide as an explanation or a tentative explanation is obviously that probably women at a later stage of their career were more involved in family obligation, and they were probably more involved in homeschooling in all this kind of country under the lockdown measure. The good news is that we did not find any difference in terms of peer review requests and tasks. So we found penalties and disproportion in terms of manuscripts submitted, but not in terms of peer review requests. And this is a very nice kind of results, which is quite probably counterintuitive. Obviously, this is just a preliminary study, and since we are just going on in improving our measurements, especially in terms of seniority and age. So we are, for instance, for measuring seniority of scholars, we use the salutations that are typically associated with all the identity of scholars in the manuscript submission system, which is probably not the best and more reliable kind of measure of age. So now we are controlling for the differences between the first publication and the last publication in 2020 to try to estimate the years of productivity to understand if we can estimate or try to understand if women which are typically in the age of maternity are even more penalized than others. So we are improving this, but the results are quite they're telling this kind of the same kind of sign of the fact that women were more penalized during the pandemic than men. And obviously, this is not just an effect that is just confined within the months of the pandemic, because if you know very well that the more you published and the more you are cited, and the more your prestige and recognition as a scholar increased, and the more probably chances you have to have promotion or to improve your career or to win some kind of grants and having funds for establishing or improving your team. So the question is it's not only about measuring what happened during the pandemic, but also to understand if what happened has already changed the landscape in terms of competition within academia, providing advantages, disproportional advantages to men and disproportional disadvantages to women. And so the question is about what to do, in a sense, how can we learn from this, and how this kind of advantages, which are typically cumulative in science, are not disproportionately paying off men in the future, also in terms of promotion career funds. And so we speculate a little bit in the end of our research about what can be done, and probably something that can be done is to consider this kind of pandemic as something extraordinary in terms of research and probably also in tenure promotion and competition for career and funds. Probably, at least committees for hiring, promotion, and also for grant proposal assessment should consider, to ponderate or to evaluate or to value what a scientist has done during the pandemic with really cautionary kind of remarks and so on. So probably this is a message that something is required already to avoid this kind of disproportional cumulative advantages men got it during the pandemic. Okay, so I hope that you got a little bit about the taste of this kind of research. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm here to respond to any question.
That's very informative and helpful, Dr. Squazzoni. Thank you so much. I think this pioneering study is actually getting a lot of attention, and we're also seeing the impact not only on women in the research sphere, but also in the workforce more generally. So it's really good to have this type of scrutiny into what the obligations are. Next up, to Dr. Falk-Krzesinski, otherwise known as my colleague Holly. Please do share the ICSR presentation. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Anne. As Anna said, I'm Holly Falk-Krzesinski, and I'm Vice President for Global Strategic Networks at Elsevier, where I also co-chair our Gender Equity Task Force. And I'm pleased to be able to have the opportunity to share the findings of our recent Gender and SDG study that was conducted through the International Center for the Study of Research, or ICSR. And what this does is move us away from the insight that was shared by Bamini and Flaminio about gender and the role it plays in the research workforce to thinking about the role of sex and gender and how it's addressed within research itself across the UN SDGs. This work that we did stemmed from 3 sources of prior work. Mainstreaming gender into the SDGs, which has been championed by the gender summits and also by UN Women. Also, back in 2017, Elsevier produced a global gender report, not unlike the one that Bamini presented on from this year. And in that report, we did some cluster analysis and visualizations that looked at topical areas of sex and gender research. And this time around, we combined it with our ability to be able to evaluate research output for every one of the 17 UN SDGs, or Sustainability Development Goals. Our study methodology was actually pretty straightforward. We built a query to identify publications that include sex and or gender topical research. Then we identified publications that include sex and or gender research from each of the 16 SDGs, and then highlight by overlaying those 2 clustered data sets together so that we could identify which SDG targets include indicators in which sex and or gender research do or don't factor in. So let me now share some of our initial study results with you, the details of which are presented in a preprint on SSRN now. In the table on the left, the 16 SDGs are listed. In the second column, the count of publications identified by each SDG query as part of the 2018 Scopus database, which represents the research corpus for each of the SDGs. In the third column, the count of SDG corpus publications that also include publications identified by the sex and or gender query. And in the fourth column, the 16 SDGs are ranked in descending order by overlap proportion. That is SDG 5, gender equality at the top with 95% overlap between sex and gender research and SDG research, and SDG 7, affordable and clean energy at the bottom with only 1% overlap. The figure on the right graphically presents the data, and you can easily see that there are only 2 SDGs that have greater than 60% overlap between the SDGs research corpus and sex and or gender research, SDG 5 and SDG 3, good health and well-being. Let's look at a few of those SDGs in more detail. Here's a query map for SDG 5, gender equality, and the subsequent figures are going to follow the exact same schema. Using the SDG 5 query within the Scopus article titles and abstracts, we identified publications that comprise the SDG targets and indicators research corpus. Terms from the SDG 5 corpus were then mapped, resulting in the figure that you see here. Larger nodes on the map equal greater occurrence of a term, and the nodes that are closer together include terms that co-occur more frequently than for nodes that are far apart. And the colors randomly indicate topical or thematic clusters of nodes, that is, different areas of research within the SDGs research corpus. This figure, also of SDG 5, is the sex and gender overlay map, the proportion of publications within the SDG 5 corpus that were also identified by sex and gender query. The color scale, referring to the share of sex and or gender research overlay. Most of the SDG 5 overlay map is yellow. Thus, the figure illustrates that there's a high degree of overlap, in fact, 95%, between the SDG publication set, or the research related to SDG 5, and those publications within the corpus tagged as also being identified by sex and or gender keyword search. Now, SDG 5 has a very high expected coverage of sex and or gender topical research, because in fact it is gender equality. So that is what we see by this abundance of yellow nodes. But let's look at some other SDGs. This is SDG 3, Good Health and Well-Being, and its term map representing the SDGs research corpus. The map shows 8 different topical clusters relevant to this SDG's targets and indicators. And here is the SDG 3 sex and or gender overlay map. SDG 3, by the way, is considered a gender-sensitive topic by UN. What we see by the large number of yellow nodes is that there, in fact, is a high proportion, greater than 60%, of SDG 3 publications that are also identified by sex and or gender query. The strong overlap between these two keyword searches is perhaps not unexpected. What is surprising, however, is that sex and or gender topical research is not evenly spread across SDG 3. The terms in this map associated with SDG 3 research that do not include sex and or gender terms, that is the green and blue nodes, are largely in the topical clusters relating to fundamental cell biology and public and environmental health in the lower half of the map. This is despite calls for sex and gender-based research analysis in research across the spectrum of life and biomedical sciences and human health research, notably through policies of major funding bodies such as the National Institutes of Health and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. This is SDG 4, the Quality Education term map, with 3 major topical clusters of research. And here is the SDG 4 sex and gender overlay map, with sex and gender research included in publications addressing around the delivery of education, the clusters on the right in yellow, but almost completely absent from the part of the map that deals with higher education, teacher training, and education policy research, which are the clusters on the left in blue. And finally, the map for SDG 13, climate action, and its 4 major topical clusters. And in this corresponding SDG 3 sex and gender overlay map, we see by way of the large number of purple nodes that climate action research has very low coverage of sex and or gender topical research. In fact, an overlay of only 4%. Thus, a stark contrast with SDG 5 and SDG 3, and even SDG 4. Interestingly, evidence is building that women and men experience climate change effects differently, and we're surprised that we didn't see more climate action research accounting for inclusion of sex and or gender analyses. Having evaluated all 16 SDGs using the same approach, we're able to draw the following broad conclusions. That the extent to which sex and or gender research factors into the SDG research output varies, both within individual SDGs and across all of the SDGs. This research study also provides a benchmark for the development of inclusion of sex and gender considerations as a critical dimension of sustainability research, and that this methodology can be employed to measure and compare ongoing progress of sex and gender-based analysis within and across all of 16 SDGs towards ensuring that we have rigorous results and inclusive, impactful policy and sustainable research overall. You can find more information about our study and about the recent Global Gender Report and the International Center for the Study and our research team at the information that I've provided on the slides that will be available. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to our colleagues at the NIH and CIHR.
Excellent. Thank you, Holly. Really appreciate that. And certainly it's interesting to see the impact that gender has in sustainability science as well as the broader issues. So indeed, next up, we would like to welcome Dr. Charlene Fauve from the National Institutes of Health. Charlene, are you with us? Terrific. I see you. I can't hear you though. Just check your mic quickly. You may be on mute.
Testing 1 2 1 2.
You are there. Terrific.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here. I am from the National Institutes of Health Office of the Director, where I serve as a senior advisor to the Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity, where our mission is to diversify the biomedical research workforce by developing a vision and comprehensive strategy to expand recruitment and retention and promote inclusiveness and equity throughout the biomedical research enterprise. And we have a vision to create cultures of inclusive excellence. And by that, I mean establishing and maintaining scientific environments that can cultivate and benefit from a full range of talent at NIH and at funded institutions. And to that end, we use data and any scientific evidence to inform our policies, our programming, and any initiatives that we begin and launch to achieve that goal. I'm going to talk a little bit about the disparities in funding research at NIH, and want to flag to you our, I guess, the role that disparities related to grant funding has had at NIH. In 2021, there was a high-profile report that showed applicants from the African American community for, I guess, one of our premium awards, the RO1s, were much less likely to be funded, 13 percentage points less than their white counterparts. And this is for the RO1s. And this is really important because the RO1 is a badge of honor that moves researchers in academia and persists in helping them to become successful. And disparities in this influence is seen in terms of who becomes a successful scientist. And these data show that there are differences that were in 2013. Because on the left-hand side of the screen, you see the number of applicants for RO1 equivalent applications. Type 1 are the initial new awards, and Type 2 are the continuation awards in FY 2013. Going back, I'm going to the moral of the story. The office where I work was created because of this funding disparity in part, and it was established in 2014. After this seminal study in 2011. And what you see is that there is an increase in the number of applicants for RO1s. The African Americans are reflected in the red bar, and they went up from about 426 in 2013 to about 548 in 2018. This is FY 2018 data, which is about a 30% or 28.9% increase in applicants. But then when we look also at FY, at the number of funded applicants on the right-hand side of the screen here, we see similarly the number of awards have increased from 12% in 2013 to 21% in 2018, which is about a 68.9% increase in the funding rate for African Americans. And while this is showing an increase, the gap still remains between African Americans and majority white populations. So we do have more work to do in that space. So next I'm going to talk about looking at the number of grants for K Awards, which is an important award for academic research or career development, as these are grants that researchers tend to receive just before getting the RO1. And what you see here is the award rate of applicants from different racial or ethnic groups for this award. And And then looking at the case series in 2013, you see the disparity in award rates for American Indians and also particularly African Americans or Blacks, 22% compared to 34% in whites. And now we are very pleased with the results to date, well, as of 2018, that although disparities persist, now or FY 2018, the award rate for African Americans was 34% compared to 37% for whites. Again, the gap is not completely closed, but it has narrowed significantly to the point where the difference is not quite statistically significant, but we're hopeful that with this change, the R01 award rates will also change. And so to that end, you know, one may wonder, what kinds of things are we doing to achieve these reductions in the gap? And this next slide describes some of the recommendations that were made and that we have implemented at NIH or are in the process of implementing. First, one intervention to close the racial gap in R01 fundings were to implement mentoring and coaching to enhance submission and resubmission of grants. And doing this at looking at different institutions and also looking at support regardless of the topic of research. And here I have the acronym NRMN, which refers to our National Research Mentoring Network, which was established in about 2014. And the network, over 5 years, began grant writing coaching programs. And those grant writing coaching programs went from about 2014 through 2019. And they had about 554 participants in them. And of those participants, about 324 participants submitted at least one grant application as a PI to any funding agency. And of the participants
in her area and her internet connection might be unstable. So Charlene, are we able to reconnect? I don't think so. There's her picture and focus. Right. Why don't we do this? I'm reluctant to interrupt her presentation. Why don't we give her a few minutes to come back online? Would you mind if I threw a question to some of our panelists? Because we have had questions coming in, and I think that might be a nice way to pivot while we see if Charlene can come back online and before we get to Dr. Tannenbaum's presentation. So I had a question come in. Are we aware of any institutions that have policies in place that are seriously considering to disregard or flag COVID-19 related publications and citations? This question came through twice. So Flaminio, I believe you referenced this in your presentation, and I wanted to know if there was broader awareness of this because it is cause for some concern.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any example of institutions already considering this, but has been discussed in a couple of reports and articles also. I remember one published probably in Science a couple of months ago. And so it's something that obviously one of the problems is that not to add a bias to remove a previous one. So and so so this is surely so probably we don't need a draconian measures now, but we probably need to discuss this point. So we need to make awareness of the problem of the possible distortions, measure these distortions, having an evidence-based approach to this problem and not only a discursive or an ideological approach. And then we need to understand what can be done seriously, considering that exactly we need to avoid to add to a bias at the end to remove a previous one, which would be probably not desirable.
Right. Very helpful. Charlene, are you back with us now? Dr. Fauve?
I am. I'm so sorry. It's very windy and I couldn't help. The internet connection was lost, but I was wrapping up.
No worries. Do we want to bring your slides back on board so you can make your last points?
Yes, I was on the very last slide and I need 20 seconds.
Okay, terrific.
Let's see. Whoops. Okay, and I was just saying the mentoring was a very powerful intervention, and that citation that I was describing has been published. It was published, I think, in 2019 and yielded very promising outputs, including awards of K awards, as well as R01 awards from NIH, from the applicants, from the participants in the NRMN. In addition, we are examining issues of bias in peer review and whether or not anonymization of applications has an impact on scores and discussion, whether or not applications are discussed, because there are issues on the far right side of the slide, relation to topic choice. And there are differences significantly in terms of what African Americans tend to submit as a topic choice compared to white majorities. Most of the topic choices tend to be things like health disparities, community research, population research, minority health. And those topic choices tend to have lower scores and also sometimes tend to have be less funded. And that's equal, it happens across all races, but it's more so for applicants who are African Americans. And we're examining that. A paper was published last year on this issue, and we're taking this issue very seriously to explore a little bit more about the underpinnings behind that. Thank you.
That's fascinating, and also echoes a recent analysis that we did at Elsevier on the HBCU cohort, which is interesting to see the differentiation in research areas sometimes coming from those universities. But it's encouraging to see the gap narrowing just in this short period since your efforts began. So thank you so much, and I will encourage everyone to type in your questions. Really appreciate it. And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Cara Tannenbaum from CIHR, University of Montreal, and also to congratulate her on the Science Policy Award she recently won for exceptional contributions in being a trailblazer in her field. So we're thrilled to have you with us, Cara, and appreciate that. Take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Anne. I'm going to be speaking about not just who gets funded, but the fact that equity, diversity, and inclusion actually refers to who benefits from the funding and what we actually study. So if we could put my slides up, I want you to take a look at this first picture. And of course it says, it's not just about who gets funded, but about what gets funded and who benefits from the research. And take a look at the picture on your right. What is wrong with this picture? Anyone want to write in the chat box? I mean, take a good look. It's an old picture. It's a good picture or a bad picture. And essentially what it shows is that, as some of you are saying right now, it's developing, safe seat belts and engineering. And what you see is a male model being researched on by male researchers. And what was the result of that? Well, the result of that was, in fact, that today we know that female drivers wearing a seatbelt have a 47% increased risk of serious injury compared to male drivers. Now, does this surprise you when you look at the previous picture? I don't know, but essentially, if you're not looking through the lens of well, women, you might forget that women are not just small men, and their anatomy and their bone density and even the strength of their bones make them more susceptible to whiplash and pregnancy injuries, because of course men don't get pregnant either. So we know that if female researchers are involved in research, then sex, biological factors, and gender, sociocultural factors, are more likely to be included in the research. Now, of course, when you include sex and you disaggregate your results by sex, then it's more likely to lead to scientific discovery. Some Canadian researchers, I'll give a shout out to Jeff Mogul, found that when he studied animals experiencing pain, it was completely different cells for the males and females that were moderating this expression of pain. We also know that if you disaggregate data, then you'll have improved findings. We know that the reproducibility crisis in research is huge, and it could be, in fact, that sometimes we're combining male and female cells, and then you repeat the experiment without reporting what proportion, and you don't get the same results. And of course, including sex and gender enhances social equalities, because you want the research to benefit everyone. I could think of artificial intelligence, where we're using training data that was developed on men, and specifically white men, and that's why Google searches come out unequally. And so there's a lot of good things that can happen if you take sex and gender into account. There's a lot of bad things that can happen if you don't. I mentioned the irreproducible science. Looking at those seatbelts, you can obviously see that policies and products and practices won't benefit everyone. And you know, I hate to say this, but people will die and have died. And now I'm going to get very serious, and I'm going to, you know, you see a picture of Vanessa Young there, a young woman who actually died from a medication side effect because the medication was not only tested not in anyone under the age of 18, but also not in women. And we know that women are more likely to have heart disturbances because of medicine sometimes. And so she died because even today we have guidance, but how often do we insist on seeing that the results from research on new drugs and medical products are really tested in women? Some of you may have followed the implant files and the reports by CBC on breast implants and urinary meshes. And of course, these were recalled from the market because they were not tested in a hormonal milieu that represented where these products would be sitting in the body for prolonged periods of time for women. Now, what you find when you disaggregate data by sex are some super interesting things. I couldn't possibly give this talk without mentioning COVID, because if there weren't COVID, I'd be there in front of you in person and hopefully waving at some of you that I know in the audience. But here you see, in the first wave of the pandemic, for countries that did disaggregate by sex, and not all of them did their mortality data, you'll see in blue men, their mortality rate in countries such as, you know, Spain and Italy was much higher than females. And this, of course, pointed us to the fact that maybe the biology is different in the way that the human body combats the virus. And this led to research on the ACE receptor, which is the receptor where the virus binds the cells to get into the cells. And we found out that it's expressed more in men. We also know that men sometimes don't mount as strong an antibody response as women do because our immunologies are different, probably because women get pregnant and maybe we protect the fetus more. We don't know all the answers, but there's an evolutionary basis for this. But what was kind of fascinating is we said, well, there might be a sex factor that is responsible for more males dying, but suddenly in Canada, at the very, very beginning of the first wave, when we looked at our statistics here, we found that actually more women were dying. And when we asked why, it really highlighted what was going on in Canada, which was that we had cracked down early and our outbreaks were really in long-term care. And so the women that were dying were actually the much older women, because long-term care, unfortunately, because women live longer, it's mostly women in long-term care as residents. More women were dying in long-term care. And of course, 80% of the healthcare workforce was women too, and they were being exposed. So this really made us start thinking about putting what we call a sex and gender lens on the pandemic, not only to help influence policies, but to better understand what was happening in terms of inequities. Now, like Charlene said, what can we do about this? And what we've done at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research is that we've started measuring what proportion of scientists include sex and gender in the contents of their research, because without measurement, there's not as good management. And the lines here in blue, on the y-axis, you see the proportion of CIHR researchers. The blue line says that they said yes when we asked them, because you're not allowed to submit your grant unless you answer the question, does my research protocol account for sex in the design, methods, analysis, reporting, dissemination plan? How many answered yes to gender and how many did both? And as you could see, many of you may know that about 60 to 70% of the research funded by CIHR is basic science research, where sex is more relevant. In fact, gender is probably not that relevant in basic science until mice can talk and say, how they want to be addressed. So there's still a bit of conflation in terms there, but you see that we got a really good response and that we've really increased the number of researchers accounting for sex and gender. What else can be done? Well, we found that not just asking or triggering applicants to reflect on sex and gender was needed, but we needed to target the evaluators or the peer reviewers. And in our SGBA peer review action plan, which we implemented 2 years ago, we changed the forms for evaluators and had them start rating whether the integration of sex and gender was strong, weak, or not applicable, and to comment on the quality of integration. We developed a 3-minute YouTube video, not easy to do, with criteria for how evaluators should be looking at quality integration, and I invite you to check it out. There's over 10,000 individuals who's already looked at that video. Then COVID came along, and as we heard very clearly from our previous speakers, women have been hit harder. And CIHR was very aware of this. We sat down and we said, what kind of policies can we put in place that would better support female applicants to CIHR competitions? Now, we put in place a number of gender policies. Some of them were already in the works because we've been thinking and doing things through the years because of our equity framework. But some things that we did is we said, well, in our first COVID competition, we really didn't give people a lot of time to apply. We were very excited that, we wanted to fund Canadian research to find answers to COVID. And so we really only gave them about a week or a week and a half to submit their application. And we realized that probably wasn't a good idea. So in our second competition, we made sure to extend the application window to make sure that women who may be at home with caregiving responsibilities, and I don't just want to say women, by the way, I want to say gender. There are some dads out there who do a lot of caregiving responsibilities. So it's really a gendered nature of the work that's done. We extended the early career researcher status period. At least in Canada, early career usually corresponds to the time when women have children. We gave 1-year extensions to all current grants. And we doubled the leave credits for early career researchers applying to competitions. And what a leave credit is if, for instance, you need to take parental leave, then if you took 6 months parental leave, then we doubled it to 12 months, keeping you in that early career period, because we do have incentives for early career researchers. For the peer reviewers, we also extended the peer review deadline because we wanted to make sure that we had female peer reviewers, simply because of the diversity lens of whoever's looking at it might see whether sex and gender was accounted for. And we even introduced childcare allowances for peer reviewers with caregiving responsibilities if they needed to be able to compensate for the time that they spent at the meetings and not looking after the kids. And or older adults or parents. I don't want to say it's just kids, because there's a lot of caregiving that goes on for older adults. And for the research content, we developed a why sex and gender need to be considered in COVID-19 fact sheet in order to provide support to those who maybe weren't so familiar with this area. We included sex and gender as a specific evaluation criteria for the second COVID-19 competition, and we even offered top-up supplements to, for people who would be appropriately factoring in biological sex to their research. Did this yield good results? Well, here's our data that I'm sharing with you. It's published as a preprint right now if you want to go see it, but what essentially it shows in the first graph is that in blue, you'll see males who applied in dark blue, and in light blue, the males who were funded in the February and the May competitions, and in dark pink, the proportion of applicants who were female who applied, and in light pink, the proportion of applicants who were female who got funded. And right away, just looking at those pink lines, you could see that we increased the applicant pool among women from about 29% to 39%. And then if you look at the proportion of people who got funded, you'll see that women did much better in the second competition as well. And in terms of, I don't think my lines came up on the graph. Hopefully you could see them. I can't see them. But the bottom line is that in terms of the integration of sex and gender, it went up from about 55% of applicants who said they incorporated sex and gender in the first competition to over 95% in the second competition. And this is my favorite part. If the reviewers found that you appropriately integrated sex and gender in the contents of the research, then we found that that was associated with funding success. So in terms of redefining excellence with equity, diversity, and inclusion included, we now know in 21st century science that if you are not planning to produce research that takes into account factors that apply to everyone, then that is probably not worth being funded. And that's the message that's coming across, and that's a really exciting message. So I'm happy to share that with you. We're pleased with how this is going. We recognize it's not perfect though. There's been a lot of iterative learning. What we're doing is we're doing interviews and collecting more information so that we could make things better as it goes. And I'd be happy to answer questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Tannenbaum. I really appreciate that. And you've given me another soundbite that happens sometimes when you're at conferences. You hear something that just catches your ear. And I love without measurement, there's not as good management. I'll add that to some of the ways in which we present data for sure. I'm going to start then and ask our panelists some questions that have been coming in from our audience. And I'm going to start in reverse, I think, because we're going with these themes. So the first question goes to you, Cara, and it reads, congratulations to Dr. Cara Tannenbaum on your well-deserved Trailblazer CSPC award. Imogen, question, exclamation point. My question is how we can really get to the issues of intersectionality within the group we describe as women, and if that is a giant homogenous group, which we all know it is not. Also, can we please move beyond EDI and be explicit about including accessibility as part of our discussions? So how do we get to that, those issues of intersectionality? Any thoughts?
Sure. So for those who don't know what the term intersectionality refers to, it's the intersection between different identity factors. And the term was coined by Kim Crenshaw, who is a Black female scholar who basically looked at cumulative or intersecting discrimination that she felt being a woman and also being Black afforded her in society and as a whole. So when we talk about intersectionality, we talk about, Indigenous women who may be living in rural areas, who may have low income, who may be of a particular in a geographic area where they don't have internet. And so those are all intersecting forms of inequities that can really disadvantage individuals. So that's what intersectionality is. The Government of Canada refers to the intersectionality part of it in the plus, in gender-based analysis plus, and in the health portfolio in Canada, we refer to it in our sex and gender-based analysis plus, because we differentiate between sex and gender. So how can we take that into consideration? There are some really great tools that are coming out, research funded by the Institute of Gender and Health on intersectionality, and it starts at the beginning of the research process. It starts at the beginning of any policy process. It starts at the beginning of any science policy process or any policy into science process, which is who's around the table and who's leading the team of individuals who are asking questions and trying to either answer research questions or develop policies. I've heard the expression, you know, where you sit is where you stand. And like I said, we know that Black researchers are more likely to make sure that there's Black participants in clinical trials. And so that intersection of having a really diverse group of people around the table, I think as you plan the research, as you plan the methods, as you look to recruit individuals, if you even ask if you're asking the right questions, is where intersectionality starts. In the middle, hopefully, you've had a questionnaire where you've asked people their identity factors and you're able to disaggregate the data. I often hear things like, oh, but we only had 10 Indigenous individuals, or we only had 3 trans men in the sample, or 5 Two-Spirit, which is, you know, an intersection between being Indigenous and being gender diverse. So should we just throw out that data? And the answer is no. Please put the raw data in the table, because at least that will allow people to pool the data from different studies, maybe do a meta-analysis, and be able to get results. Obviously, in clinical vaccine trials, we want to make sure that there's sufficient sample size of different populations so that when you say, is the vaccine safe for me, if I'm, which I'm not, but if I were, I was speaking to a good colleague, a 65-year-old Japanese woman, and I said to her, are you going to get the vaccine? And she said, well, they probably studied it in white younger men, so do I know if it's going to be safe for me? Well, by making sure that everyone was included in the study sample and being transparent about that, and maybe even having community leaders or health liaison officers, we could get that message across that intersectionality is important. In terms of disabled individuals in Canada, we look at different equity groups. We look at not only male, female, and visible minorities and Indigenous individuals and disabled people, but the data that I presented for COVID, we actually did look at disabled people. People with disabilities, I should say. I'd like to correct my language. I'm trying to speak better too. Language is important. And so that would be people with disabilities or people living with disabilities. And we looked at that data. And again, some of the numbers were a little small, but we're hoping to be able to encourage people to come up and express disabilities. That's not only physical disabilities, but also mental health disabilities, so that we really can develop more inclusive policies. I hope that answers the question.
Indeed, it does. Thank you so much. It actually dovetails with another question that came in, and I'll just throw it to the rest of the panel because there seems to be a lot of interest here. Have the panelists engaged or know of research on the experience of transgender and non-binary researchers in the workforce? So it's a slightly different question, and I wonder if others would like to comment on that specifically.
Yeah,
Charlene,
I can.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I can say is one of the things that we're looking to do, well, in the study that Bamini has shared, we are only able to use binary designation for gender. Actually, in thinking about gender and the role it plays within the research workflow process, as individuals are looking to serve as reviewers and be authors and editors in chief of journals, we've really expanded that so that we're going to be collecting information going forward on non-binary gender designations as well, so that individuals have more flexibility in being able to share with us about their gender identity, and we can track that data better. There is, though, some challenges associated with that, and that is GDPR compliance regulations and policies, which also say that you shouldn't collect data that you don't actually need. And so one of the challenges that we're finding is being specific as to asking somebody to acknowledge whether they're cisgender or transgender, then necessarily gives you some insight into, with regards to their biological sex, not only their gender identity. And so the question is that really information that we genuinely need, or do we need to err on the side of caution and not ask, but in fact use terms that are inclusive, and perhaps we won't be able to gather such precise information, but we'll be able to be more inclusive with the information that we do. Now, of course, you have to take different considerations when you're capturing gender identity data as part of the research workflow process related to publications than you do certainly if you're thinking about biological research and thinking about vaccine development. But these are some of the challenges and ways in which we've been thinking about these is making sure that we're collecting the data that we need, but doing it in a way that aligns with policies and regulations, and being cognizant of some of the limitations around any data that is collected, and then being cautious about the conclusions that you can draw.
Excellent. Thank you, Holly. Appreciate that. I'm going to change topics a little bit. We had a question come in specifically for Dr. Fauve. I hope you can take this. It says, Dear Dr. Fauve, you mentioned that the grant writing mentoring network was operational from 2014 to 2019. Did it disband permanently, or was it put on hold during COVID, even though some research may be able to continue, or will it relaunch once the lockdowns are over? And I might add, there is a broader question about, I think, mentoring in general as a result of these issues is, I think, important. So,
yeah, so the data that I shared was a result of the grant coaching and mentoring intervention spanning from 2015 to 2019 in the National Research Mentoring Network, which is still very much open. The National Research Mentoring Network is an ongoing resource. If you type in NMRN and NIH, you'll go to a website. It's an online portal that allows mentors to, over 1,000 or so mentors to enroll and put their information in, and then mentees can participate in the portal and be matched. The grant writing and coaching intervention itself, sort of the data for the report that was published was from 2019, but the whole effort is still ongoing, those coaching workshops and mentoring interventions for thousands of early career biomedical researchers who have a commitment to career in biomedical research and who are from underrepresented groups. Was there a second part to the question, Anna?
That was the entire question, but I do think that there is, a broad, your answer and my question was broader than the way the question itself was posed, which was, is this continuing? And
yes,
I think addresses both of it, that it's a much broader issue, and it probably stretches beyond just the National Institutes of Health. I don't know if other panelists would care to comment on the role of mentoring as an intervention as part of their programs.
We certainly here in Canada expect the universities to do a lot of the mentoring for grants. The Canadian Institutes of Health Research is set up a little bit differently than the NIH, where we don't have program officers. But at this point in time, there's a great group of university delegates who interacts regularly with the granting councils, and it has been advised for a while, and to my knowledge, almost every single university in Canada assigns mentors to investigators, especially early career investigators who are submitting grants. So in terms of a mentorship program offered by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, I don't think we have anything as formalized as you're fortunate to have at the NIH, although many of the institutes do host new investigator meetings. We often pair investigators with leading experts in the field. A lot of the programs that we fund are about trainee networks, or I think we're going to hear at this conference about the health system policy fellowships. And so there's mentoring that occurs, but in Canada, to my knowledge, at least at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, we do not have a similar program.
And I do want to comment that NIH has a notice for intent to publish a funding opportunity announcement called FIRST, which the acronym is Faculty, Institutional Researchers, and Sustainable Transformation, where the hallmark is a cohort model for hiring early career investigators who have a commitment to diversity in science, and mentoring and sponsorship and support in institutions to create a successful career trajectory and R01 award applications and so on for up to 12 institutions across the United States. And that funding announcement is going to be on the streets, we hope, very soon.
That sounds amazing. Congratulations. Maybe one more thing, if there's any Canadian early career investigators in the audience here, that there's more and more funding opportunities that come out. For instance, there was a clinical women's health research mentorship award where, in order to apply for funds, both an early career investigator and a senior investigator have to be on the team. And I think you know about the Frontiers program, where sometimes in the eligibility criteria, we're making sure that researchers of different career stages and diverse backgrounds are included so that we put together the team. So I guess that's kind of informal. I guess it's learning by doing, if you will. So for those of you who are listening, keep your eyes out for those.
Excellent. And that kind of dovetails nicely into a question that we have here about the creation of incentives and related metrics. So the question reads, how are funders and research organizations creating incentives to support gender equity in terms of their impact measurements and career development metrics? So we have these programs which hopefully will move the needle on some of these things, but also change the way we measure success. Do we have any thoughts on that?
Well, I would say, Anne, that, importantly, I love that the question is really thinking about that we need to fix the system in which women and men are operating, and ensuring that there are greater levels of equity within that system. So I think that that's exactly where they need to be, is thinking about it. And we've seen programs through the NIH, as mentioned, through CIHR. The National Science Foundation in the United States has had a program called Advance that has been focused on institutional changes related to promoting greater gender diversity and inclusion and equity overall, which includes making sure that there's equal access to opportunities, including promotion and tenure and senior leadership positions. So I encourage people to look to see what's there within the ARC network that's sponsored by AWIS, the Association for Women in Science, and NSF. They have a platform where individuals can learn about what different advanced institutions have been doing. But I also think then it's really important to have the data, and this goes back to the project that Bamini and I worked on, the Global Gender Report, is having that data and then understanding at which levels you want to investigate it, and being critical of the data. So Bamini showed that the analysis included looking at different cohorts. So I think it would be unfair to say simply that there are just more women now in the pipeline than there ever had been. Perhaps what we're seeing is that there are women and they end up early in the pipeline, but then they fall out. Or it could be that there are more women earlier in the pipeline and more women are going to remain in the pipeline longer than the cohorts before them did. And these are the kinds of observations using data that institutions need to make, I think, to evaluate just how well their policies and the interventions that they're developing are working. And so that'll be really important to combine it with data.
That's great.
So questions about carrots or sticks. Canadians are polite, and carrots work up to a point. The tri-agencies, so NSERC, SSHRC, and CIHR, has certainly developed wording in their applications saying that they strongly encourage and expect to see diversity on research teams. But at the end of the day, it's really about the evaluation criteria. I could think of a stick that was applied when we were funding our Canada research chairs about 2 years ago, when we asked the universities to look at their quotas and make sure that they were nominating as many female scientists as male scientists. And certainly from the data that I presented today, when we ask reviewers to assess whether sex and gender are appropriately accounted for in the research, then we see that there's higher levels of integration and that it's associated with funding success. So we're politely encouraging everyone to take this into consideration. Wording on grant applications is changing. Whether or not you see harder sticks starting to come down to enforce these policies is something that you can stay tuned for.
Thank you. There's a follow-up question. I'm not sure how this reads in connection with this conversation, but does anyone want to comment on metrics used for the fellowship funding applicant screening and how these may be biased to begin with? Is there an inherent bias in the way applicant process screening is working now?
I'm happy to tackle that one, but want to give someone else a chance to weigh in.
Sure. Take it away, I think.
The government of Canada, because of its gender-based analysis plus policy, does do audits on how well we do GBA plus analyses, and GBA plus analyses are really a process. And so I know that either last year or the year before, there was a GBA plus analysis done of the student bursary, the postgraduate bursary programs, and there were some points where there may have been the possibility of bias. First off is in the emphasis on leadership criteria, particularly in reference letters. We, like I said, and I corrected myself, language is culture and culture is language. And if we're trying to change the culture, then we have to change our language. But what has been noticed is that in reference letters referring to male applicants, we use some of those standout adjectives like stellar, cutting edge, top, I don't know, wonder, I can't even think because I don't even think that way. And of course, for the female applicants, it was more great collaborative team member and really worked hard. And so you get kind of those grindstone adjectives. And so questions about the utility of reference letters have come up. In terms of Indigenous applicants, many Indigenous applicants didn't have the privilege of completing a secondary education, but have had fabulous work experience and have done a lot of evaluative projects in their communities. And so insisting that you have a 4.0 grade point average from your university degree is going to exclude a lot of individuals from even making it to the application point where they could perhaps pursue, secondary education or research or evaluative training later on in their careers. And so we've been looking at those kind of systemic barriers that could be embedded either in the application process or in the criteria for looking at how you make the cut for getting a bursary. And those are currently under evaluation.
It's very helpful. Thank you. Right. I'm going to change gears a little bit and go back to the question of authorship. And Flaminio, we had a question that came in early from your presentation, and I just want to make sure that we're addressing it to the fullest, which is, why do women seem to publish less as senior authors? Is it less submission or more rejection? And I know you addressed this a little bit in your comments, but I'd just like to come back to that because then I have another question related to authorship that we can ask.
Yeah, that's a very, very important question. So we did not control about editorial decisions. So this is the next step, is also to understand not only if there's a disproportion between women and men submitting manuscripts, but also if there's a different rate of death rejection or acceptance later. So this is still the next step in our research. However, I mean, what we found is exactly this one. So, and I mean, to respond to your questions, at first we are trying to measure age better than what we have done so far, which, as Holly, said before, it's very difficult to get this kind of data about gender, but also data about age is even worse. And so we ran our analysis with different kind of measures of age or estimator of age of scholars in our 6 million data set. However, our explanation is just tentative. So, and we would like to understand if women at later stages probably got a combination of maybe also care in the family and homeschooling, and a combination of these could probably explain why they submitted less. Or another tentative explanation is that PhD students of younger scholars due to the hyper competition and job insecurity, which is dominating academia worldwide, were pushed to continue to submit. Otherwise, they were out of the market and out of the job. And so it could be also probably both mechanisms could be at the same time working. So one does not exclude the other one. But this is something that we would like to understand better in the next stage of our research. But obviously, this is what emerged from our data set. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's very helpful. It also raises a question of, I think, differences between cultural forces and concrete policy and things that can actually be impactful to women. I have a question for the group. We saw in Bamini's presentation that Argentina and Brazil and Portugal have high proportions of women authors. And in your experience at your organizations, what exactly are countries like these doing right? More broadly, is this an international disparity, or is it culture? Is it policy? Is it both? And what can we do better from those examples? Would anybody like to have a run at that?
Sure, I can speak to that. Oh, go ahead, Flaminio.
Yeah. One of the things that I probably asked to Bamini is that it could also be probably this different kind of international rate of. So there's plenty of young scholars or scholars from those kind of countries who typically got PhD or career abroad. And so I would like to ask if you did control for that, because it could be another source of bias in the sense that maybe men have more chances to get a PhD abroad, whereas probably women did less chances. This could explain this kind of disproportion. And as another source of disparity is probably the possibility of having an international career.
Right. Very helpful.
Yeah, so I think.
Go ahead.
I think mobility is greater among men than women, especially in the younger age groups. But the way we assign authors to a country is based on their publications in the last 5 years, at least for the report. So I think the data we're looking at reflects a mix of culture and policy, and maybe just kind of the self-selecting, who ends up being scientists in these places, and what the economics is like. In the qualitative analysis, we saw a lot of comments that were sort of like, oh, a lot of people have left science, or like all the men have left, and that kind of thing. So I do think like there have been intentional policies to increase women in science in some of these countries where we're seeing a closer to parity, but culture and science in particular, I think is also part of the reason.
Thanks, Bamini. So I have just a couple of more questions before we arrive at the hour. I have one coming in about data collection. When discussing data collection, there's a need to recognize that some populations, rightfully, are reluctant to share the information because it has the potential to be used against the communities. How will the needed data collection be used to advance diversity and protect the participants? I think that presents a challenge. Thoughts on data collection?
Yeah, actually, I can. Oh, go ahead, Cara.
Go ahead, Charlie.
Yeah, so actually, it's a great question, and I was just in a meeting yesterday talking about not only the kinds of data that you collect, but where and who has access to them when. And so we've been talking, for example, on being able to collect information around gender as part of the publication workflow process, but we're also very careful about ensuring when that information is visible and when it's not visible, and also how it's shared. So it's one thing to collect information at an individual level, but only make it apparent and visible in an aggregate. And so these are, again, some of these balancing issues that we're currently dealing with. And so we're erring on the side of We're not going to let anybody see it during the process of any part of the peer review, but rather that data will only be available to limited administrators, and it will only be reported in aggregate. That is, you'd have to work incredibly hard and be a part of our back-end team to be able to get out the information for a particular individual. And therefore, that individual's information won't be visible to anybody who's engaged in that process. At the same time, we're able to have that information and we can gain insight from it in understanding the dynamics across different genders as they are participating through our processes. So it's about the kind of data that you're collecting, the platforms that you have to collect it, and understanding how that data is going to be represented, as well as who's going to have access to the data and when.
Fantastic. Any other thoughts there?
Well,
Yeah.
for me, sorry, go ahead. Well, for me, it's clear that if the populations or groups whose data is going to be collected are included in the group who asks the questions and decides why we need to be collecting that data, that's sort of when you said, how do you include intersectionality in the methods? Then if we know that the data is being collected to try to be of benefit societally, particularly to groups who are underrepresented or who need that data collected in order to help devise policies or solutions to some of the issues that they're dealing with, then it would make sense that you be transparent about why the data is being collected from the get-go. And if we're asking the right questions because the right people are asking the right questions because they have lived experience and know what needs to be answered and how it should be included, then maybe it won't be an issue. Certainly at this point in Canada, we have the OCAP laws to protect Indigenous communities in having ownership over their data and the right to be said how it's used. And I think we have to underscore that. But again, I'm not sure we would need those kinds of protections if at the leadership of teams asking for the data collection, we know why it's going to be used and everyone felt confident and had trust that it would be used to benefit those communities.
Wonderful. Flaminio, we have a quick question coming in for you about where the preprint is located. And I'm so concerned about losing my space on the interface that I can't type it into the chat, but it is on SSRN, correct?
Yeah, it is. It is in SSR archive, yeah, from probably a month, something like that.
Okay, fantastic.
May I just comment on Cara? May I just comment on the last point by Ollie Cara? It says that, yeah, this is a brilliant point because the default options about that is to be big. So, for instance, I always use big data set, and the biggest the data set is, the lowest the probability that someone could be spot in the data set and so on. However, this has the implication that minorities are underrepresented. So, and as Cara said, I mean, this could be in the sense that if some from the minority is studying exactly, posing questions and studying exactly the problem the minorities, this could solve probably this kind of problem. So it's a brilliant kind of suggestion, yeah, like that.
Great. So then a final question for our panelists. What is the one thing that we think one policy implementation that we think would be most effective in helping diversity following the COVID crisis? What can we do to mitigate some of that?
I think making sure that we have diverse representation on the decision-making bodies that are going to be coming up with the policies and solutions, because without, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but without that connection to individuals who have the lived experiences, we're walking blind. And I think we like to know, I think we like to think we know everything, but we don't. And it's only really by having diversity around the table to bring forward the voices that haven't been heard, who don't feel comfortable speaking up in order to draw attention to themselves, or who, you know, it's not easy being the only one too. And by diverse representation, I don't mean, you know, one Indigenous individual. Individuals are First Nations and Métis and Inuit from, you know, reserves and urban. We really have to just get all those voices to be able to say what they think would help, because gone are the days, I think, of authority figures knowing what's good for everyone. And if we could build back better that way, then I think, as horrible it is about all the people dying from COVID, at least maybe there'll be a silver lining to the pandemic.
And then I would add that in the US, at least, there's a disproportionate number of deaths among African Americans and brown people. And that means there's a disproportionate number of scientists who have family members who, are underrepresented group scientists who also have family members, or there's 6 degrees of separation from the death tolls, who are having extra stressors in the face of COVID. And then the fact that there's an overlay of the social injustice pandemic means there's heightened discrimination, heightened issues of sensitivity around racial disparities in general. So we have to really, really keep in mind not just being at the table, but that we don't lose the early career scientists who are in the, we don't say pipeline, but who are trying to become independent scientists, who may have a disproportionate number of deaths in the family, a disproportionate amount of mortality and morbidity in relation to COVID-19 that is impacting their caregiver, their lifestyle, their ability to do their research in a higher way than compared to majority white populations. So we want to keep the pedal to the gas around our interventions and our mentoring and our sponsorship and our resources to those researchers in the pipeline. Women as well, and underrepresented groups, which include women.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. Hear indeed. And I think we're going to have to end it there because we are now officially into overtime. But I want to thank from the bottom of my heart our distinguished panel on Bamini Jayabalasingham, Dr. Flaminio Squazzoni, Holly Falk-Krzesinski, Dr. Charlene Fauve, and Dr. Cara Tannenbaum. It has been a really informative and impassioned session. And I thank you for your eloquent advocacy in this regard. And we hope to continue to support you through data as we move forward. Thank you all, and thank you also to the Canadian Science Policy Centre. I'm also instructed to say there's a survey after this, so please do fill it out if you get one, and we appreciate your feedback. Thank you kindly, and to all our participants who provided questions and made this such a highly interactive session. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.